Hi everyone, welcome back. Ex-racing greyhounds may have limited experience of other breeds before they leave the racing environment. And to watch some of them, you could well believe that they consider different breeds of dogs to be as alien as cats and squirrels are. Let's take a look at the fascinating subject of how your greyhound understands other breeds of dogs. I've always been fascinated by how greyhounds perceive other breeds. After all, they smell like a dog, I presume, but many of them look nothing like a greyhound. They might be widely varying in size, they might have different ears, different tails, different lengths of fur. You might not be able to see the eyes amongst all that fur. And they may even make very different noises to the noise a greyhound makes, as well as moving differently to a greyhound. So, do greyhounds even understand that these are also dogs? I've had greyhounds who will totally ignore other breeds as if they're of no interest whatsoever. But if they spot another greyhound in the distance, we have to go and meet that greyhound, and there is no option about it whatsoever. So, to help me take a look into this fascinating subject, I'm joined today by Dale McClelland, who has kindly agreed to share her insights with us. She's a canine behaviourist and she has had a variety of large breeds, including the two Old English sheepdogs that she currently lives with, who, of course, couldn't be a great deal more different to a greyhound when it comes to appearance.
So today I am joined by Dale McClelland, who has agreed to share her insights with us about this topic. And Dale is a canine behaviourist who also runs her own doggy daycare. So thank you for coming, Dale.
You're welcome.
Could you tell us a little bit more about your work to start with?
Yeah, as you said, I'm a canine behaviourist. So what does that mean? That can mean a lot of different things to different people, but essentially I work with clients and their dogs when there's either been a bit of a breakdown in communication or there's some specific behavioural challenges. And it's really about looking at the complete dog, their environment, their health, all of these things have to be taken into account. There is a bit of a difference between a behaviourist and a trainer as such, although I do obviously need to understand about dog training, but it's not necessarily about training our dogs to do specific actions on cue. But when we look at behaviour, it's so complex that it can be quite difficult to find out exactly what's going on for the dog or for the people. So it's a really interesting role, but it's certainly not a straightforward, we just need to train the dog to do this and everything will be fine.
Yeah.
And of course, the other side of things that I do is I have daycare and boarding service. Initially, they were started up for many of my clients who had dogs who were not comfortable around other dogs or not comfortable around people. That no one could go on holiday. They couldn't leave their dogs with anyone. So initially I started up so that I would be able to offer some dogs a place for them to go where they could either carefully be introduced to other dogs or they could come here for their holidays. But of course, that sort of grew and grew and changed over the time. And so the dogs that come here now are, some of them are very sociable, and others are selectively sociable, shall we say. So yeah, it's a varied life with dogs. And I think that the key thing about working with dogs, as you know, Jill, is that we have to see each dog as an individual, and it's really hard to summarize and put into a set of words exactly what it is that we do or that we are, aiming for.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think the main thing is to look at each individual situation and think what has either gone wrong or how can that be resolved.
And thinking about the different breeds that come into your daycare, obviously some of them, and the boarding, some of them perhaps from slightly tricky scenarios in the first place in terms of the dog itself. What sort of differences do you see in how the different breeds communicate? Thinking about breeds of, say, big differences in size or different facial structure or different degrees of hairiness. Particularly the last one interests me as a greyhound person.
Yes. It's interesting, isn't it? Because I think when you like a breed and you have a preference for a particular breed, you get, hopefully, you get to be really good at reading them and you start to understand their body language. Now, when I first started daycare and boarding, I'd had quite a large number of breeds over the years and crossbreeds. But of course, there were some dogs that I'd never actually lived with, you know. So some of the smaller, I've never lived with a small dog ever. And it's really interesting that one of the things that I found most different about dogs of different sizes is that I never ever felt inclined to lift the little dogs up. And yet when I saw their owners with their dogs, they were lifting these little dogs up all the time, all the time. And I thought that's really interesting because I've always had big dogs. You kind of don't go to lifting them, you know, even as puppies, they're not that small for long.
No.
And I thought that's really interesting for me. And then what I did notice from that is that lots of small dogs, their communication largely went unnoticed with
That's
humans
interesting.
because it was overridden so much. Because you know, one of my Rottweilers, for instance, if I wanted him to, you know, to come over towards me or to come away from something, you know, I would have to invest time in teaching him, you know, when I ask you to come, you come to me. And so I would have to invest time in that. I certainly wouldn't be going over and grabbing a collar and pulling them. But what I noticed was that the smaller dogs, you could request that all you like, and they really didn't respond. And a lot of the time, I'm pretty sure it's because they were never asked to come away from something. And so what would happen is the owners would just go forward, lift them up and take them away. So one of the things that I noticed was size did make a difference to how the dogs, I suppose, imagined that they were going to be heard as well. So lots of the smaller dogs would do much more barking, much more vocalization than the bigger dogs. And they would bark at very, you know, very small triggers, you know, small things that the bigger dogs didn't worry about. And the interesting thing for me was once I started to look at different dogs and I realized there's similarities in the, you know, the communication methods and the signals. But some of them were not impaired, but some of them it's harder. So for the likes of my old English sheepdogs, for instance, who are very hairy, I can tell and I can look at hairy dogs and I can see some of the little subtle signals. But actually, you might miss that in another breed of dog. For instance, I have two French bulldogs that come here, and their body language is very different, you know, from a staffy, from a cockapoo. So once you really start to look at these different breeds, and you start to see there are similarities that run through all of the breeds, of course, and the crossbreeds. So there are similarities, but obviously their physical makeup means that for some dogs, showing some of those signals will be more difficult than for others. And while they might still be there, they might not be noticeable because of the hair or because of excessive wrinkling. And also, I think because some dogs' facial expressions don't really change that much. It is quite subtle.
Mm,
Um,
mm,
so it's interesting for me, the more experience I've had with different breeds, to realize that I got to know my breed of choice very, very, very well. I possibly didn't know the other breeds quite as well.
mm,
And so that was an interesting thing for me
mm,
to find out for myself,
mm,
but
mm,
also not to make that big assumption that because a dog is hairy, because a dog has got more wrinkles, that they can't communicate, because they could still communicate, or we would have had a lot more incidents of
mm,
fighting or upset between dogs.
mm,
Uh, so it can't all be, it can't to dogs all be the signs that we are familiar with looking at,
mm.
or there would be
Yeah.
far more
Mm.
issues between them.
Yeah. I would.
Look out for new videos every Monday, and why not subscribe so you don't miss out?